Hi, everyone, and welcome to the AI Ethics for Remote Sensing session here at the Geo for Good Summit. Just in case you missed me yesterday, I'm Matt Hancher, and I'm the engineering lead for Google Earth, Earth Engine, and the other products that we've been talking about a lot this week. But today, I'm excited and really honored to be moderating a conversation on a set of topics that are very near and dear to my heart. Uh, as deep learning and similar methodologies power more and more of the tools that we use every day, including in remote sensing and mapping, it's really important for us to examine the ethics and the principles behind science and data sets that are powered by AI. Of course, machine learning is not new to remote sensing. Many of the concerns that we're going to talk about today apply perfectly well to conventional machine learning techniques that have been in use for decades. And the basic questions of privacy or sovereignty or misinformation come up anytime we talk about mapping, regardless of the specific technologies. But that said, recent advances in machine learning are really amplifying some of these concerns, making it more important than ever for us to have this discussion. So I'm very excited to have this opportunity to explore these topics with our panel today. I'm joined by three leaders in their respective fields who bring three different perspectives to this conversation. First, I'm here with Matt Hansen, who is a professor of geographical sciences at the University of Maryland and who has been working for over 25 years on global land cover and land use monitoring using time series and Earth observations.
Thanks. Great to be here, Matt. Appreciate it.
I'm also joined by James Rattling Leaf, who is a global Indigenous consultant who works to support Indigenous peoples' nation rebuilding efforts through effective and respective application of traditional ecological knowledge as well as Western science. James, welcome.
Wopila Mac, and I want to greet our audience today in the Lakota language. I'll say how midaki api chante washte na pe chizapalo James Rattling Leaf imacha api na chichanga Lakota oyate.
Thank you so much, and welcome. And finally, I'm joined by Lisa Lehmann, who is a moral philosopher with expertise in public health and clinical medicine, and who is the director of bioethics here at Google, as well as an associate professor of health policy and management at the Harvard T. Chan School of Public Health.
Hey, Matt, and hey, everybody. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited about the conversation that we're going to have.
It is our pleasure. Welcome to all three of you, and thank you so much for all of you for taking this time with us today. In just a minute, I'm going to kick off the conversation with a few preliminary questions for the panel, but we'd really love to make this interactive by taking questions from all of you who are viewing the live stream as well. So if you're watching this live, right down below this video, you'll see a big blue button that says Ask a Question. So click it. What questions do we as a remote sensing community writ large need to be asking of ourselves with the advent of these new technologies? What factors should we all be considering when we apply machine learning in our science toolkit? What other topics in the ethics of mapping and remote sensing are you interested in hearing the panel talk about? Let us know. So with that, I would like to start us off with a question for Matt Hansen. So Matt, just as a bit of background, some of you may know he was one of our very first partners in the Earth Engine project, working in the area of forestry and building some of the global data products that power the Global Forest Watch application that you heard about earlier today if you've been watching this entire program. Recently, we've seen how the impact of those that monitoring and those alerts are really becoming very visible. We've seen significant reductions in deforestation in certain areas tied to that work. But Matt, when we first started this project together, trying to make it easier to do this sort of mapping at scale, you raised a number of concerns that we were struggling with at the time about the potential impact of bad maps. What happens if the technology makes it too easy for people to produce information that may be wrong, maybe misinformation, and lead to potentially bad decision making. So I'm curious, looking back on the last 10 years, have we seen this sort of proliferation of bad maps? What has worked, what hasn't? What lessons would you take from the last 10 years for how we should look at applying these technologies in the next 10 years to have the impact that we're hoping to have in the world?
That's a big question, and it's an important one. I remember in the car with Rebecca when she was just, we were in Brazil, in San Jose dos Campos, and she talked about democratization of mapping capabilities. This is Rebecca Moorhead of Google Earth. And it is great. In principle, the more eyes you have on any set of data, the more creative thinking applied to solving problems around that data, the better outcomes are likely to be. But at that time, with the kind of immediate onset of cloud computing and tools like Google Earth Engine that really allow people to turn big cranks rather quickly, the question was, are we going to have 1,000, I said crappy maps? Are we going to have a bunch of maps, a bunch of characterizations? It's not eloquent, sorry, but that was my off-the-cuff remark in the cab. And would that be confusing to it would be confusing to the users, the community around our discipline. We expect that we have these objective signals that are, geophysical from space. And if we apply algorithms, we'll get, a consensus, a convergence of evidence, but that is absolutely not the case. If you train an algorithm incorrectly, or you make some poor assumptions on the inputs in terms of pre-processing, you can come up with orthogonal outcomes. And so I think around the use of machine learning and AI and big data, you have to have data scientists with domain knowledge to tune the data and train the data in a way that will produce accurate products. So we switched very quickly from just making maps. There was a really interesting transition. In the 90s, early 2000s, we were happy to make global maps, just make a map and then compare it with some data from FAO or something. Just kind of back of the envelope comparisons with whatever other sources we had out there. But now we put a high emphasis and premium on validation and area estimation using statistical methods to support the map making. So I think when you had this proliferation of maps, it puts an onus on the rigor of validating and showing that your map can be trusted to support decision making. And that's where we are in a transition right now. I would say that there are a number of maps that are getting, scientific publications right now that are out there that are not following best practices. IPCC, for example, has a good practice guidance method for doing area estimation around maps, so that we can have accurate deforestation estimates at national, global scales and local scales. So I think that the democratization of the capability has really improved the rigor, I think, of our discipline. But that's not a wave that everyone goes at the same speed, right? But this is that we're shaking things out. But I think we're trending the right way. And my fear of the 1,000 crappy maps still there, but I think we have a way forward to reduce the risk around that. But yes, bad data can lead to bad decisions, and we want to avoid that with this data because it undercuts the potential of the whole system and the buy-in of users.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. It's a great point about the importance and the developments in techniques for validation as much as for mapping, for example. James, I wanted to bring you in to look at this from a different perspective. I know that a lot of your work is around developing climate adaptation strategies for tribal lands and territories, and specifically that you've been involved, for example, with the TerraDept project that we heard a little bit about earlier today. Can you say a little bit about why it's so important for Indigenous leaders and communities to be directly involved in making the map, or involved early and often in that process?
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you for the question. And I do believe that. I think there's a term that I've heard, and maybe I'll share it. If it's about anything about us should be with us. And I think that, at least I'm promoting this idea of partnerships again, and the importance of partnerships. I'm just going to highlight these last 2 days. I was privy to be a part of the White House Tribal Nations Summit, and at that meeting, we had tribal leaders from here in America all coming together with federal agencies to talk about the importance of tribal partnerships and the role of federal government in advancing tribal nation rebuilding, as I like to say. And I think that to the question about the importance of data, the importance of map, Indigenous people have always been information gatherers. We've always been decision makers, and we have always tried to get the best information we can, not only to make decisions now, but also for the future. So I think we do have an opportunity here today and going forward, not only learning from the past of how maps sort of been used against us in a way as Indigenous people in terms of development and even big terms like colonization, which I'm not sure how Google thinks about the term colonization, but I think if we're having an honest discussion, I think we have to be very aware that Indigenous people are on this decolonization pathway. That we're beginning to understand what happened to us, so that we can know where we're at right now, understand how we got here, but also where do we go from here. They just concluded COP26 again, and there was a lot of discussion from Indigenous people looking at the whole process of how consultation with Indigenous people came about, and just really understanding again how these decisions are made with or without us. And I do think that companies like Google have a tremendous responsibility to really look at a new framework, or a framework like the United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People. That's a framework that's been supported by Indigenous people around the world. The issue right now we have is the implementation of, they call it UNDRIP. So I think that companies like Google and partners that work with data, certainly the data providers and all those groups that advance remote sensing, I think they're
Oh, I think
there is an opportunity to build those. What are those best practices going forward?
Thanks. I think we had just a little bit of an internet glitch at the end there, but Lisa, I wanted to bring you into this conversation. James alluded to the impact on various communities that maps and decisions based on maps have. There was recently an article in Bloomberg put out by, or rather featuring, one of our other partners that we've heard about, I think today, or at the summit, called Cloud to Street. They're a company that uses Earth Engine to warn communities at risk from floods. But they have raised the concern that it's not always appropriate to share everything fully, openly, and transparency because of some of the unintended consequences. For example, in South Sudan, they ran into challenges where they were warned not to make their maps public because locals were worried about the gangs of marauders from rebel factions in that context. Now, so we know from experiences like that data transparency has risks. Can you say a little bit about how other fields that you've been involved in have addressed some of these risks around data transparency, for example, in public health, where actually transparency is rare for other reasons related to privacy? But just talk a little bit about transparency and the unintended consequences and how we should think about that.
Sure, Matt. So that's a really excellent question. And before I dive directly into that, I just want to first acknowledge how important it is and how grateful I am to the organizers of this summit for including a session on ethics, so that we can really put ethics front and center and be thinking and anticipating what those ethical concerns are, so that we can really work towards mitigating them. And I just think this is a best practice where we're bringing everybody together to think about this. And in particular, the partners here at this summit who are so engaged in all of the research, it's all of you who have the insight into the most challenging ethical issues that we need to be thinking about. So that's just one preliminary comment. The other thing I just want to acknowledge here is the important work that our responsible innovations team at Google has done in this space through the development of our AI principles, and in particular, Jen Janai, the founder and director of the responsible innovations team, Uni Nair, who's done a tremendous amount of work on surveillance, and Jeff Keeling, who's in our bioethics programs, have all contributed to, I think, our thinking on these important issues. So when we think about, and thinking about transparency and responsible data use is definitely a core ethical issue in AI. Fundamentally, ethics is really about evaluating the trade-offs and figuring out what the best course of action is. And as you mentioned, Matt, in public health, there's often a trade-off between individual privacy and transparency, or sharing information that can benefit the public health. I think that there's a framework that I'd like to share for that may be helpful in terms of thinking about these trade-offs. And there's three broad categories that can, I think, help guide our thinking here. One is, first of all, thinking about the severity of harm to the data subjects, right? So when we think about the epidemiological modeling of disease in public health, we may be dealing with very sensitive health data, but not all geospatial data carries that same level of sensitivity. So you can compare, for example, a high-resolution map of a city that pinpoints houses that have swimming pools and compare that to a high-resolution map of a city that pinpoints houses that may contain one person who has been diagnosed with HIV, right? So the latter is really sensitive information that we have to be very careful about protecting the privacy of, and disclosing that publicly would constitute significant harm. But the former, like if we're just talking about swimming pools, there may be some minor privacy infringements, but the harm we might say is really negligible. So really thinking about, first of all, what's the severity of the harm to the data subjects? The second element here that I think can be helpful is, well, what's the probability of the harm? And so that's another component that's important, right? When we think about privacy measures such as that may mitigate harm, such as centering geocoded information to the midpoints of regions on a map to substantially lower the probability of disclosing personal information, that can lower it, but it may not completely eliminate the potential privacy infringements, because it really depends on the context, and it depends on what's the prevalence of the disease in that particular location. So thinking about, well, what's the likelihood of the harm in addition to the severity of the harm, I think is important here. And then the last concept that I think can be helpful as we think about these trade-offs between transparency of data and privacy is, what's the magnitude of the benefit, right? We really need to be thinking about how these tools that we've created, that you've created and your team has created, can benefit society in terms of the impact that they're having on climate change, the impact that they're having on deforestation, on our crisis response, right? So we really need to be taking the totality of these considerations into account as we think about these trade-offs and the risks of that data transparency.
Thank you. Let's turn to an audience question at this point, which is for Matt Hansen. And this is a question from Guy Ziv. I apologize in advance for mispronouncing anyone's names. But the question here is, first noting that it's becoming difficult for non-experts to know whether any particular Earth Engine output is actually good. And it's going to get even harder when we go into the world of deep learning. And there's a lack of kind of agreed protocols in some cases, or easy reusable code. Can you comment on, I think part of what he's asking about here is, for the non-expert, so the end user of this data, how should they know whether a product is good? What should they be looking for when evaluating a product? And I guess the flip side of that, I think you alluded to some of this, but maybe you can say more, or where are the standards or best practices that practitioners should be turning to be producing high quality products?
There's a whole list of requirements from really very clearly defined themes being mapped so that they lend themselves to validation. So having very structured design around your mapping project, and then more importantly, the validation, this secondary effort to, and I can talk about it, I could digress technically very quickly, but this idea of validation through an independent set of data that you can build a number, an accuracy or confidence around the map, and that goes through peer review. The map should be available, the validation data should be available, all the terms well defined in a peer reviewed publication. That kind of little box right there is the first order like threshold around which you can say, I can trust this data to a certain degree to support my decision making, whatever, if you're mapping you're estimating carbon stocks or trying to estimate encroachment into a protected area. So I think that's my short answer there. But there are methods, and I think that you have to look for the documentation to check those boxes, and then that'll build a comfort level for you to use the data.
James, I have a question I wanted to pose to you. A lot of what we're talking about here, applying AI and mapping technology, this is a very technocratic conversation that's rooted in a sort of particular cultural context. And it's not the only cultural context of importance or significance. So how do you think it makes sense for us to think about the relationship between these technocratic approaches and, for example, traditional ecological knowledge that may be embedded in indigenous communities or other contexts? How do we combine these worldviews as we have these conversations?
Well, isn't that the big question? I know, going back to the White House summit yesterday, one of the memorandums that came out from the Biden-Harris administration was this idea of the importance of judicial ecological knowledge. And what's going to happen, as I heard yesterday, was the development of this guidance document that the federal agencies will come together through a multi-agency task force. And so that's what's before us. I guess in my lifetime, I've never heard, the federal agencies come together and try to reduce those silos to address the issue of judicial ecological knowledge. And I guess I look at it this way: you really can't separate the people, the tribal nations, from the knowledge. So that's one thing. It's not something that traditional. It's not something that we publish or we put in a book or we put it in that way. I think that today we find ourselves, as indigenous people, really at the cusp of something important. We heard tribal leaders talk about the importance of traditional knowledge and really addressing issues like drought and water resources. We heard great stories from tribes in the Southwest of America, really putting forth solutions to how they want to manage their water through recharging and recharging an aquifer of all things. And again, that's tribes' efforts to really rebuild and proactive. And they use state-of-the-art hydraulic sciences to do that work. And I know that that's inspiring to me. And I think we need more of those stories. And I think there's an important differentiation between groups here. We're talking about ethnic groups, and remind our audience that as tribal nations, we are political entities with rights. And as we go down this pathway to understand how we're going to bring our knowledge into, let's say, co-management of national parks in America, let's say that's on the agenda. I would advocate for the best available information, best available knowledge, and best available data. I think we're coming to a point now in America that tribal nations are really exerting their place again, and they're really building their capacity to work with data governance systems. Then I would also say that in part of that is really looking at our young people. I work with the University of Colorado-Boulder, and we just launched the new, what we're calling the Tribal Climate Leaders Program. And these are master's students. It's a cohort of 5 students from the Great Plains region. And again, they're tackling this whole issue about the role of traditional knowledge and Western approaches to understanding. So we're excited that I think the young people will lead the way in terms of being involved in Google and doing those sort of things. But also I think the value as well is that they're really going back and working with our elders and knowledge holders. I do think that this is a really important time in our country when it comes to taking care of our land, taking care of our water. Just today, again, we saw what's happening in Colorado with fire. I think fire is a tool that, and I heard this also on the news, that this idea of cultural burning. And again, that's where tribal nations come in. That's where TEK comes in to work with agencies to how to manage fire. And so that fire affects everybody again, right? Tribal nations as well as not. And so I think we have this opportunity. I think universities have an opportunity. The private sector certainly has an opportunity. And then I think Native people are standing in the wings. We are standing in the wings ready to be brought into the conversation of how we use our knowledge. But we need to do that in a respectful, relevant, reciprocal, and relational way. So thank you for the question.
Thank you. Lisa, a question for you. Again, thinking about how we might be able to bring some of the lessons of bioethics over by analogy. I gather that you were involved in a study of patient attitudes towards disclosure of genetic research results and some related studies. And I'm curious, what issues do you expect to see based on what you've seen in that world as we're looking at making more and more data, more and more high resolution information, for example, readily available? How do you see the attitudes of different groups sort of reacting in different ways, perhaps, to that broader availability of information?
Yeah, so really loved what James just mentioned in terms of the importance of our working together with Indigenous populations, and not just Indigenous populations, but the individuals who are affected by this work. And so I think we really, as we move forward, we need to be doing this in ways that are really culturally sensitive and respectful of the sovereignty of different countries. and the fact that in certain, high resolution data about land surfaces could reveal very sensitive information that certain countries may be very concerned about. And I think we need to figure out how we move forward in a way that is respectful of that, and at the same time allows us to leverage the benefits of this technology for good, for society. So that I think that there's still a lot of work we can do here. We have to, I think, also carefully consider what kind of control there should be on the flow of information here. When we talk about the democratization of these tools, there's tremendous potential for good, and also I think empowerment in particular of vulnerable populations. But there's also the risks that we need to be thinking about. And I think as we have more clarity on those risks, which I think we'll talk a little bit more about, we'll then be better positioned to think about what are the solutions to mitigate some of those risks. But moving forward in ways that are really culturally sensitive, and where there's bi-directional communication and engagement with those who are affected by this technology, I think is an important way forward.
Thanks. Yeah, that question of engagement and that principle of making sure that all the stakeholders are actually in the conversation seems so central here. Matt, I wanted to toss the question, an audience question, back to you. This one is from Enrique Bonilla, who asks about how you see the role of mixing both non-traditional data and methods like deep learning with more traditional data and methods like demographics and surveys. And if you see sort of enough work or publications on that topic, any thoughts there?
I don't know regarding the topic of our session, but I think that the satellite is a great indicator of like a proxy. It points out features that can leverage socioeconomic and demographic data. For example, when we work in places like Central Africa, we see poverty from space, and that poverty that we're mapping spatially explicitly correlates with anthropometric survey data from demographic health surveys done by wholly different entities, by intergovernmental entities, and we can extrapolate much better the degree of a human development in either its presence or absence at scale. So I like the idea more and more of the satellite not mapping everything we wish it could, because it can't. It's more of an indicator product. And if you're smart enough and creative enough thinking, you can come up with an algorithm, an AI algorithm that will show a stress, show an intact habitat or a degraded landscape. And then that will correspond to biodiversity survey data or demographic health data. So I like to think of it like this. We need to understand the limitations of satellite data and think more about how to integrate it and use it complementarily with in situ data. This is super powerful, I think. And if I could just go back to another comment, the idea, I'm 100% sympathetic to the idea of harms and trying to avoid them. But what if the harm was a government that was hiding or trying to obscure the reality of let's say a deforestation rate? So one of the aspects I think is very powerful, but also risky with satellite data is that we can see certain facts from space that can be beneficial to government, or let's say human development goals like environmental sustainability, sustaining ecosystem services and the like. And we always thought that our work with forest cover mapping was this way to compare apples to apples. We see coming out of Glasgow that a lot of the emissions accounting methods for countries are totally, finger in the air, huge assumptions on let's say carbon sinks, sources. And the satellite helps us kind of normalize that and check. It's a check on whether or not the estimates coming out of country A, B, or C conform with what we're seeing from space. And I know that that's a sovereignty issue, to Lisa's point. And my question is, from an ethical perspective, how do you define harm? and what is good or bad use of our data. That's just tricky to me.
Yeah, I think this is really getting into maybe the meat of the discussion, and actually resonates directly with another audience question that we got from Michael B. And I think James and Lisa, I would love to hear both of your thoughts on this. This is getting at the question of private versus public data and how we know what's what. There may be some clear-cut examples, he writes, but in some cases, the interpretation of what is private is quite subjective. And he mentions, Lisa, your example, that some people may not even want the fact that they have a swimming pool to be public. We can see a lot of things from space, and there's a lot of discussion of public good. How do we think about this question of the public versus the private when it comes to GIS or mapping data? And maybe James, we can start with you. Any thoughts you have on that topic?
Well, I mean, I think that's the tension I think that we live with as tribal nations. I know, one of the things that of great concern, and I'll just sort of use the example of the Dakota Access Pipeline. That happened several years ago on the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation here in South Dakota, North Dakota. And when the tribes were trying to make the case of these certain places of cultural significance to the Lakota people, they wrestle with this fact of should they use satellite imagery, should they use high resolution data, and even looked at LiDAR and some of those other technologies to map that. The issue that I guess one issue would be in is that they'd have to submit those places, those points and those lines and polygons into court. And so there was this great tension discussion, as I understand it. I wasn't there personally, but I heard it from some of the tribal leaders. And so this whole idea about, again, is how much do we share, and if we do share, will that be protected? And are there ways and policy and laws that we can do to do that? And a lot of that work, comes under the cultural resources, and so there are federal laws that are in place to protect tribal cultural heritage and those resources, sacred sites and places and things like that. But I think that what the tribe did was they didn't submit that, and what happened is that those places were destroyed anyway. The pipeline went through anyway, and they dug up all that anyway. And so we as the tribes also have a responsibility, and I think we need to look at our own tribal laws. We need to look at our own things that we can do, and to advance a way that we can do a better job of how we use this data, how we share it, how we affect policy within the federal government, because we have that unique relationship. So when it comes to that, so I think the Dakota Access Pipeline and all that complexity of that issue raises the questions about data and how we use it, how we map it, but also what do we do with it once it's mapped? And who owns it technically? How should that be shared? And I think that's open questions that I don't have an answer today, but I certainly raise the issue. Thank you.
Lisa, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on this question as well from the bioethics perspective, say, and if there are any lessons there about how we think about private versus public data. Any more thoughts on that?
So I think this is a really difficult question, and in part, it really needs to be considered within the context of the specific of a specific example, I think, because when we think about the trade-offs really between public and private data, there's a question about the purpose, right? So the why someone wants to use the data, and is the data use going to have significant benefits to from a public good perspective, and what is the harm to the individuals, right? So if we just think back, for example, to some of what Google has done in the space of COVID, and a lot of the modeling and COVID mobility reports, which looked at in the aggregate in terms of location of individuals, that there has been tremendous benefit from a public health perspective to understanding that kind of location data and using that kind of data. And some people might have argued that was too private, that involved an invasion of privacy. And at the same time, there are significant benefits from a public health perspective. So I think that we really need to be thinking here about, well, what's the purpose of the use of the data? What exactly is the harm? both to individuals as well as to groups, right, and in particular vulnerable populations and societies and countries that may have specific kinds of information that they feel are particularly sensitive. And we need to be taking the totality of all of those considerations and trying to make an assessment about the risks and the benefits and the trade-offs, trying to have the big picture in mind.
Yeah, that's such a great point. It's so easy for us to wish for big, simple answers to questions, to these hard ethical questions. And so often, I think the real answer is you have to dig into the details of the individuals in the case and do the hard work. And that's a great lesson for all of us. We have just a few minutes left here. And James, I wanted to bring up a question from Alexander S., who noted that respectful and relevant partnerships are so important. And he was wondering if you'd be willing to share more on how you believe agencies, researchers, or educators can show up to build respectful partnerships with Indigenous peoples, particularly in regards to sharing data. Yeah, any thoughts?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I think everything starts with being ready to engagement. I know that we're at a different place in time as travel nations collectively, if I could say, but we're all at different places in terms of what we can do and how much we can do. Just understanding again that our capacity development is still there. I talked about the idea about even our broadband capability as an Indian country is still woefully inadequate. Hopefully, the infrastructure bill and some of the funding that's come in is going to address that, and I think it will. I think the other part, again, I think is digging into this traditional ecological knowledge aspect of the work for a scientist. How do you prepare for that? Well, I think there's trainings, and I think there's efforts to prepare scientists to engage respectively with Indigenous people, to understand again our history. I'd say also is understand our history. Take some time to understand who we are, where geographically where we're from. Increasingly, you hear more and more science organizations doing these land acknowledgements. I think those are good first steps to be aware again that we're still here as Indigenous people. November is Native American Heritage Month, and so again we're doing a lot of things to advance understanding of Indigenous people, kind of where we're at. And again, finally, I would say that let's really look at this new memorandum from the federal government. If I was a scientist coming into this space now, working for an agency that's tasked with any kind of management, I would really look at this opportunity and prepare yourself to work. And maybe your job will be to engage with the tribal nation on some kind of issue. And so anyway, you got to prepare yourself. I think there's a lot of people like me and others who will work with the organizations and prepare them through training and capacity development. So it's a good question. And I think this will grow and grow and grow in terms of this interest. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Well, I know it's hard to believe, but we are already at our time here. This has been a really wonderful roundtable. Thanks so much, Matt and James and Lisa, and thanks to all of you in the audience for all of the great questions. Sorry we didn't have time to get a chance to answer all of them today. I think we could easily have filled a full afternoon at least with a discussion on these topics, but I'm really glad we at least had this chance to get together and explore them. So yeah, thank you again to all the speakers for your time and for your dedication to this vision of trying to construct a more ethical mapping and remote sensing program together. And thanks to everyone for joining us here at Geo for Good. In just a few minutes, the Earth Engine team will be here for their Ask Me Anything session, answering all your Earth Engine questions live. So please do stay tuned for that. Should be a lot of fun. And have a wonderful summit, everyone.